Americans are latching on to any way they can get out of China because things are about to get complicated. China had high hopes for an economic revival in 2023, especially after loosening COVID-19 restrictions that previously held it back. But things aren't exactly going as planned. In fact, from the looks of it, China's economy might be about to nosedive, leaving expats in panic. So let's dive into why exactly Americans are rushing out of China. A warning to the businesses. During his recent trip to the US, President Xi Jinping urged American companies to see China as a close trade ally. But interestingly, he was met with a contrary sentiment, the suggestion that these businesses should start moving their operations away from China while they still can. For years, Western companies have heavily invested in China's economy, and thousands of Chinese students have studied in US and European universities or worked for Western firms. Surprisingly, this hasn't led to greater democracy in China. Instead, Xi's regime has propelled the country towards totalitarianism, erasing even the basic checks and balances introduced after Mao Zedong's era. What's particularly striking is how China harnesses Western technology to suppress dissent, spy on other countries, and spread misleading information. Beyond this, trade patterns over recent decades have shown democracies becoming more reliant on autocracies rather than the other way around. It was evident during Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, when the EU hesitated to stop buying Russian energy, shelling out a staggering €140 billion despite the conflict. Even the US, importing goods worth over $500 billion directly from China in 2022, reflects a significant dependence on a single source. All this trade and investment aim to strengthen bilateral relations, yet it's increasingly seen as a failed foreign policy. There's now a growing agreement that moving production closer to home and sourcing from geopolitical allies is crucial, especially considering market forces alone can't rectify these imbalances. There's a push for promoting green technologies to reduce reliance on controversial regimes for energy and for restricting funds from antagonistic regimes in politics, education, and media. Regardless of the upcoming US elections, you can easily expect more sanctions and restrictions on trade with China if their leadership doesn't pivot course dramatically. It's a sign that a substantial trade war could be looming unless US investors start diversifying their suppliers sooner rather than later. This shift reflects the realization that relying too much on a single economic pattern might not be the best long-term strategy. This means that any American expat in China who has set up a business in the country might choose to move out. But there's much more going wrong with China than just its regime. The whole country in turmoil. There's a whole mix of issues throwing a wrench in the works. Slow consumer spending, a wobbly housing market, dwindling exports due to US de-risking efforts, sky-high youth unemployment, and massive local government debt. And here's where things get bad. President Xi Jinping's crew doesn't exactly have an easy fix for all these woes. Now folks are talking, wondering if China's economy is on the path to a Japan-style funk after 3 decades of crazy growth. So what's China doing to handle this? They're trying to aim for a 5% growth rate in 2023. In a world where the economy is expected to crawl at just 2.8% in 2023, that might not seem too bad at first glance. But here's the deal. China was still following strict COVID-0 rules in 2022, which kind of skews the numbers. Once you take that into account, growth for 2023 will likely hover around 3%, which is less than half the speed it was zooming along at before the pandemic. On top of that, China's consumer prices didn't budge in June 2023, and the prices of goods leaving factories decreased even more. That's got people worried about the dreaded deflation, a downward spiral of prices that can mess up an economy. But how bad are things really about to get? The seriousness of China's economic trouble. The country's got a massive market and a huge role in global jobs and production. The IMF predicts that over the next 5 years, China will be the biggest contributor to worldwide growth, accounting for about 22.6% of the total growth, which is double the contribution expected from the US. Going into the details, China's $18 trillion economy is struggling in quite a few areas. The latest data showed that manufacturing took another hit. The exports, which were a rock during the pandemic as Chinese factories raced to fill orders from the US and Europe, have shrunk. From hitting $340 billion in December 2021, exports dropped to $284 billion in May, mainly because the US and Europe slowed down due to rising interest rates. But it gets worse. The US is trying to choke off China from advanced tech supplies like semiconductors, stuff that's super important for future economic growth. They call it strategic competition, but China's calling it containment. To add to the mix, China's import of goods dropped 6.7% in the first 5 months of 2023, following a slight uptick in 2022. And don't even get me started on the property crisis. Back in 2020, the government tried to rein in real estate developers, drowning in debt to lower financial risks. That move dragged housing prices down and led to some weaker companies going bust. Many developers stopped building homes they'd already sold but hadn't handed over yet, which made some homeowners rethink paying their mortgages. This whole chaos made people realize that property, once seen as a solid investment and a way to store wealth, wasn't as surefire as they thought. The authorities tried a rescue plan late last year, but that didn't exactly trigger a buying spree. Fast forward to mid-2023, and the prices of new and old homes have been dropping every month for over a year. But here's the thing, there aren't enough new buyers showing up to get things back on track. Last year, banks handed out the least long-term loans to households in almost 10 years, and borrowing was down another 13% in the first 5 months of this year. That means fewer people are taking out new mortgages. To top it off, in July, China said it's extending policies to help struggling developers and prop up the shaky property market, like letting them delay loan repayments for a year. So, can China's government pick things back up? The game plan. The People's Bank of China slashed interest rates in June, a classic move to give growth a boost. This surprise move got people thinking that more monetary and fiscal help might be on the way. Some ideas on the table include loosening up property restrictions, giving tax breaks to consumers, pumping more cash into infrastructure, and sweetening the deal for manufacturers, especially in high tech. But changes to policies have been more on the small side, like extending tax breaks for new energy cars until 2027. But there's a catch. China's got a huge public debt, and President Xi's trying to curb property speculation as part of his common prosperity plan. That could make it tough to splash out on big spending plans. There's news that the big state banks are now giving loans to these local government financing vehicles for super long periods and giving them a break on interest, all to dodge a credit crisis. Plus, some cities are lowering the cash you need up front to buy the property and axing the rule that stops people from buying multiple places to get the property market back in the game. As of now, if you look at where China's economy stands, there's a massive surplus of houses, which means even if there's a push to get things going in property, it'll take ages for it to translate to new construction. Plus, with the population shrinking and the speed of people moving to cities slowing down, there aren't as many things pushing up the demand for housing in China. That spells out a possibly long stretch of weak growth while they sort out the debt issues, kind of like what Japan went through in its lost decade after their property and stock markets went haywire. When you put it all together, these factors could throw a wrench in China's plan to zoom past the US and become the world's biggest economy, something they thought they'd pull off by the early 2030s. On the contrary, Americans who have settled in China are almost ready to leave as soon as they can, and the country realizes it too. So, of course, They aren't going to sit still and watch as everyone leaves them behind. China in panic. Recently, the United States gave a heads-up to Americans who were about to travel to China due to concerns about the country's random law enforcement, exit bans, and the possibility of unjust detentions. No specific incidents were highlighted, but this advice came after a 78-year-old American got a life sentence on spying charges in May. This caution also followed China's recent sweeping foreign relations law that threatens actions against those seen as harming the country's interests. China also passed a counter-espionage law and a law to sanction foreign critics, making the foreign business community wary. The advisory from the US emphasized how China's government can arbitrarily enforce local laws, including issuing exit bans on US citizens without a fair process under the law. It cautioned that citizens in China could get detained without access to US consular services or information about their alleged crime. The advisory also mentioned China's wide discretion in deeming various materials as state secrets and detaining foreign nationals for alleged espionage. The advisory outlined how exit bans could coerce people into joining Chinese government investigations, compel family members to return from abroad, and even influence civil disputes in favor of Chinese citizens. Similar alerts were issued for Hong Kong and Macau. As you can see, China isn't helping itself in the Foreign Relations Department, but there's a reason for that. Strained relations with the US. China relations are at a low point over various issues like trade, technology, Taiwan, and human rights. While efforts to improve the situation have been made, incidents like the recent visit of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to Beijing indicate some attempts at dialogue. However, tensions persist, evident in the protest China made after President Biden referred to Chinese leader Xi Jinping as a dictator.
He is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that
Biden's commitment to defending Taiwan if China attacks it further strained relations. Currently, there are strong ongoing concerns about the safety of Americans and others in China. The unpredictability of law enforcement and the risks of unjust detentions are what's scaring people away from the country, and that's exactly why they want to leave so badly. What do you think about China's crumbling economy? Let us know in the comments below. And if you liked this video, do us a solid and smash that like button. Make sure to subscribe so you'll be the first to know about upcoming content. Buckle up, folks, because there's a lot we have in store for you.